Chapter 10 of Ingold is one of my favorite chapters because it's the most, well, he says it's partly autobiographical. It's surely the most autobiographical chapter in this book. And it also helps to, I think in some ways, to lay out what he calls the dwelling perspective and what he contrast that with the building perspective. Now, I think we should always keep in mind that he later wants to not so much concentrate on this word dwelling because it sounds too cozy and like a little fireplace going in the background. And so he wants to talk more about habitants and inhabitation. But you know, it's a word switch. So as long as we don't start up the fireplace and imagine a bunch of Heideggerian Germans sitting around their cozy fire making sausages. I don't know what they do, but you know, that cozy German place, that's what they do. As long as we get rid of that, I think we're okay. And we can also get rid of some of the political stuff. And anyway, all right, so let's go. So Ingold begins with this idea that he starts out, he wants to know something about what humans, the interaction between humans and their environments. This was always a big thing of his. That's what he wanted to know. Is he's on his journey. And so he begins with our good buddy Clifford Geertz. Now we've seen Geertz before. We'll see Geertz again. Geertz has some great quotes, some just beautiful things. You can look up this quote in the images section and they'll come up with some pictures for you. Here's one of them. So Geertz was the person who gave us the recipes, rules, and computer programs of chapter 9. Man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun, and I take culture to be those webs. I was in college, this is like, whoa, suspended in webs of significance that we've spun, man. It was like, can get some serious highs off of that one. But as Ingold says, what about the animals that actually are suspended in webs that they themselves have spun, like spiders and ticks? Because maybe we're suspended in webs, but if we are, we can't see them. Whereas, you know, there's a lot of little non-human animals out there that actually are in webs and they've spun them. So are they, is that their culture? Right? Is that the spider culture right there? Suspended in the web of its own spinning? And, you know, this caused Ingold to ask, why is it that anything that is considered to be artificial is basically equivalent to the man-made? Whereas if a spider makes it, it's considered to be natural, not artificial. Now, I can't spin a web like that. That would be hard. Not able to. Yet, if I do something, they're like, oh, that's an artificial thing. What makes something artificial or natural? So these are some starting questions and starting assumptions. And so if you turn over or you think about houses and lodges that people make, and you compare the beaver to what people make. In this case, it's on page 174, compared to the floor plan of a house in the Arctic. Ingold says that in their respective forms and levels of complexity, they need not be that different. That is the beaver house or the beaver lodge versus the human house or lodge. And Ingold doesn't specifically quote this book, but it's kind of an amazing book. It's actually from 1868, The American Beaver, and its works. And it's by Lewis Henry Morgan. We sometimes get down on Lewis Henry Morgan in anthropology. And we actually do have a prize here that we give to the first year student with a high achievement award. It's called the Lewis Henry Morgan Prize. Lewis Henry Morgan is kind of an alternate to Franz Boas as a founder of US anthropology, but he wasn't really academically trained and he didn't really produce a lot of PhDs, and he wrote a number of books and did some field work, but he's often associated with those ideas of unilinear or unilineal evolutionism. He's associated with ideas that that then Engels and Marx borrowed about primitive communism. So he gets kind of a bad rap these days for those people who consider themselves more heirs of Franz Boas and the idea of historical particularism. But this book is really cool. And in general, his books are worth looking at least. In this book, he talks about how when Europeans came to the Americas, there were something like 75 million beaver in the continent, and just doing all kinds of wonderful things, damming up rivers and creating, basically laying the groundwork for various paths and roads and features that we still have to this day because they were used, but they sort of had transformed the entire landscape of the Americas. So here are these wonderful architectural beaver, and Ingold asks, is the lodge beaver made just as much as house is man-made? So, why should man-made be artificial and beaver, it's beaver-made? And then he says, I answered in the negative, which is a complicated way of saying, never write this many words when you can use only one. Complicated way of saying no. I said no, he says. Why, Gabe? Why would you say no to this?
Because people make humans make meaningful decisions on what things look like. And
well, back up a second from there. Yes, the idea is we do make meaningful decisions, but what's the evidence for, if you were looking at the beaver houses and you're looking at the human houses and you're comparing them, what's the evidence that there's something else, there's something different going on?
The beaver house is it's, I wouldn't say less accommodating, but it's it serves pretty much one purpose, but a human house has so many other purposes that are not just for dwelling.
Yeah, and I think, I'm sort of prodding you on this a little bit, but it's the idea that okay, the beaver houses, you go one, there it is, it's the same as another beaver house. And so the idea is there's something sort of, some people say that when a beaver hears the sound of running water, they start running over and getting sticks. They just can't help themselves, it's all going to be the same all over the place. And the only difference would be that, maybe there's the different kinds of wood or what but it's given to them in their environment. They don't go out and go looking for stuff. Whereas humans might have a hut, they might have an igloo, they might have a Jaeger, they might have a little house, they might have a mini house, a gigantic McMansion, all over they have all kinds of things all over the place. And so the idea is that while other animals, non-human animals, can maybe imagine this. This is a very interesting work by von Yuxkel about how different the fox and the owls and how they are they're using the tree in different ways and as their home and all these things. And the idea is that it's only human beings that can imagine this not only as these different things, but can imagine it as a tree, as itself, as sort of set off from us. And that therefore, yes, exactly, entirely correct, Gabe, what we do is we imagine things before we do them in the world. And so this can mean that there's a sort of sub point here that we can co-opt objects. So on page 175, you don't even need to necessarily transform what you find in nature. You might just bring it into your design web so that you can use it as a tool. Looking around, because sometimes I bring in a stone to illustrate that I can find a stone or a rock and I can start hammering things. I haven't changed it, but I have some idea in my head that I can bring this I can co-opt it into my design process. I can use it to, it did the one time that I did have a rock around, it got kind of dangerous in class. So I then kind of put that to the side, started hammering on things. Then I need to throw something and yeah, it wasn't pretty. Anyway. So Ingold says in 1987 that he comes to the conclusion, as on page 178, I concluded that making is equivalent to the cultural ordering of nature, the inscription of ideal design upon the material world of things. So this is what Ingold thought in 1987. And well, Willa, what happens with that idea? It's embarrassing. Yeah, I always laugh at this. So he's very embarrassed by this. He published it. This is the problem. This is the problem in academia, or when you write something down and you put it in an article or in a book, then all of a sudden it's out there. You can't just delete the post. You can't delete the tweet. It's there. It's worse than even having a screenshot of your work. Then it's circulating about. Somebody might quote you and say, Ingold said, blah, blah. So now he's very embarrassed about this. The next thing he says, though, is, in my defense, in his English way of just saying defense, we always defend ourselves by saying in my defense with an SE, but in the Brit world, they defend themselves with a CE. In my defense, what's the most common defense? If your caregivers say, why did you do that? I didn't know. That's a good one. I didn't know. I think there's an even more common one that somebody surely has used it. I didn't know is always a good one. I had no idea. What else can you say? Why did you do that? Why did you go there? You're just gonna get, you knew it was gonna be trouble. why did you do it? That's the next thing he said. But Mom, everybody was doing it. You've never used that? Everybody's doing it. That was his defense. He actually then goes back and he says, I can only say that I was singing a tune that has been sung by most anthropologists. Everybody was doing it. This is the song everybody was singing, and I was just singing along. So he goes back to Gertz. He says, it's the hallmark of humanity, culture, the imposition of an arbitrary framework of symbolic meaning upon reality. So again, this idea that there's reality out there, and then what we do, what's a hallmark of humanity, our cultural ideas, is to take this arbitrary framework, or I might say arbitrary sounds, and have a symbolic meaning upon reality. And so the idea is that what we humans do is to build worlds, make worlds, before we live in them. We already have our house built, and then we go live inside it. So we make our worlds before we live in them. Now, as Ingold says, this brings up a few issues, because again, you'll notice that the hunter-gatherers occupy this ambiguous state. Do they actually build things before they live in? They don't seem to. They seem to be, going around, and as we've seen before, they seem to simply be living in, according to the Western view, in nature or in the environment, and they seem at home there, but they don't seem to ever transform it. So they're in this sort of, again, they occupy this ambiguous place between the culture and nature. And so we basically have come up with this idea that, okay, if humans, we're thinking about them before we build them. So we didn't say they had to be made, but they had to be thought. So in this schema, you have villagers, people who lives in towns and agricultural and villages. In that case, they're able to think about their buildings and actually build them and live in them. And you have the pastoralists, the herders, who would be thinking about, their tents and the things that they're, but they don't really completely ever build them there because they're on the move. And then in order to give the hunter-gatherers kind of full cultural humanity here, the idea is that they have thought it out. Is they have all the mental stuff there, they have all the culture, but they never actually build it. We've actually seen this kind of idea back in when Godelier was writing about the difference between production systems and kind of and had come to the conclusion that in some ways the hunter-gatherer was the most mental and the most separated from nature. And it's a weird idea, but basically it's that, they have all the cultural knowledge and they have an idea of what things could be, but they don't actually instantiate it, or it's instantiated in the environment or pinned onto it, you might say. So again, this is this idea that what makes humans uniquely humans is our ability to impose our own cultural designs upon reality, that they're going to be different in all different places. There's going to be different cultural differences, but we shouldn't say one is worse than any other. And then, of course, this idea that somehow there's a thought process or a design process behind it. And so that leads to a number of questions. So if this is true for human beings, the idea is then that there must have been some kind of time when people separated themselves and weren't involved in just the evolutionary part anymore. We're still evolving, but somehow there's a separation so that you're separated from simply gathering up sticks like the beavers do and building the first houses. That there's a point, maybe we'll go to Ingold's own words. The point our ancestors were sufficiently endowed with the qualities of intelligence and manual dexterity to become the authors of their own projects of building. There's some sort of line between, you might say, nature and people. And so the question is, well, when was the first thought, the first time that people think about this, and what was is there a first hut? And there's this wonderful picture, figure on 10.6, the idea of the first hut, which is just in some ways an imagination, or it's not, it's a projection backwards. The idea is that there's apes that are building their nests from the ground up, but humans build these huts over their heads and construct them and then start living in them. And so we have this idea that there must have been some sort of line, or some sort of gradual at least a gradual separation, so that humans develop the ability to not just do nests, but to construct these other kinds of systems. This is, on page 183, where they're again trying to compare human campsites with what non-human primates would be doing. They think that it can all be put down to one factor, namely the human ability to, quote, visualize objects in new configurations and to bring these configurations into being on the basis of that mental picture. So what Ingold is saying here is this whole search is premised on the idea that there was a process or an evolutionary moment that when people cease to be purely creatures of nature, creatures of evolution, and begin to be historical and to be varied and to have culture, to have these different kinds of dealing in the world. So we got up to page 185, and the wonderful thing about this chapter is there's an easy way to read this chapter, in a sense, is that anything up to page 185 is probably something that Ingold's going to disagree with. So everything from 172 through 185 is a questionable assumption. So don't worry, Gabe, he actually does agree to disagree with you. I mean, he disagree. He absolutely agrees to disagree with the idea that the beaver house should be, seen as something natural and the human house is something designed. It's confusing because it takes him a long time to get there. But yeah, if you read up to page 185 until he gets to that section called the dwelling perspective, he's basically saying how wrong he was, explaining why he was wrong, but had a good reason for it. And then, finally, except for a few people on page 173, who we should talk a little bit about, we'll see this kind of perspective come up again. So we talked about in chapter 9, we talked about dissidents in sociology, like Pierre Bourdieu, and dissidents in psychology, like James Gibson, and dissidents in philosophy, like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, and then we put up all the dissidents in black and white photos, and they all turned out to look very much like old white guys. But here we have some actually slightly, different looking dissidents, some dissidents in biology who we don't hear so much about. I don't know if they're taught up there in Johnstone or not. Ingold says they're courageous scholars, mostly developmental biologists. So people who are concerned with not a lot of biology is concerned now with the genetic stuff, and these folks are more concerned with how organisms actually develop. And Ingold says that they are courageously challenging the hegemony of neo-Darwinian thinking in the discipline. And we've seen this a little bit before back in chapter 2, the idea of, kind of that fitness can only be exhibited through genetic change. And I guess I would say that neo-Darwinian thinking has been a very important, the idea of merging Darwin with Mendel has been a hugely important step. But some biologists have said we need to kind of go beyond that, or it's not a complete explanation for biological life. So a few people here to keep our eyes on: Mae-Wan Ho, Peter Saunders, and Susan Oyama, who will come back up later when we talk more about the genetics and biology stuff. But I just wanted to point them out here. So a few people are okay back on page 173. The rest of it is questionable until he gets to this idea of dwelling and building. So here, for the idea of dwelling, he goes into Heidegger and this essay called Building, Dwelling, Thinking. And what Heidegger is saying is he goes back into the etymology or of the word dwelling, or at least some of the older senses of those words. And Heidegger tells us that actually, in its original sense, the word for dwelling was kind of, well, I guess in our contemporary sense, when we say dwelling, we don't usually we mean kind of being in a house. That's why I was talking about the cozy fireplace. So the building, we often think about we're in a building, and that's where our life takes place. Or as Ingold puts it, the building is a container for life activities. And what Heidegger is saying is that building was circumscribed within dwelling, so that the dwelling, or the kind of being able to dwell or inhabit a place, was the reason you could build something. It wasn't that you lived in the house, it was because you lived that you could build the house. Maybe if we have the Heidegger on page 186 it'll help us out. Here's Heidegger. We do not dwell because we have built, but we build and have built because we dwell. That is because we are dwellers. To build is in itself already to dwell. Only if we are capable of dwelling, only then can we build. So, yes, what does it mean? What it means is that the forms people build, whether in the imagination or on the ground, arise within the current of their involved activity in the specific relational context of their practical engagements with their surroundings. So it's because we're engaged in our surroundings that we can build stuff. Now, what does then differentiate humans from non-human animals? And I'm starting to think about those birds' nests and things like that are pretty sophisticated, or even the spider webs that are pretty cool, or the beaver lodges. And what Ingold says is basically we may be unique in terms of being able to imagine and envision uniquely among animals, have the capacity to envision forms in advance of their implementation. But this envisioning is itself an activity that happens in the real world. So it's because we're dwelling in the real world that we're able to have these thoughts. And then page 186 is super crucial, I think. There's a wonderful part at the bottom of page 186, which I think sums this up a lot. For any animal, human, non-human, all animals, the environmental conditions of development are liable to be shaped by the activities of predecessors. The beaver, there's an animal, for example, inhabits an environment that has been decisively modified by the labors of its forebears in building dams and lodges, and will in turn contribute to the fashioning of an environment for its progeny. In other words, all those beaver dams and lodges that Morgan was talking about, then the young beaver are born into those and develop within an environment which has already been shaped by previous beaver activity. It is in such a modified environment that the beaver's own bodily orientations and patterns of activity undergo development. So it's not going to be just a beaver born into a place where there's just a bunch of sticks lying around. These sticks have already been assembled on down the line for generations. The same goes for human beings. Oh, here we are. Human children, like the young of many other species, grow up in environments furnished by the work of previous generations, and as they do so, they come literally to carry the forms of their dwelling in their bodies, in specific skills, sensibilities, and dispositions. So again, he's saying that human children, like beaver children, other children, any animal, are going to be part of their developing environment. They do not carry them in their genes, nor is it necessary to invoke some other kind of vehicle for the intergenerational transmission of information, cultural rather than genetic, to account for the diversity of human living arrangements. So the fact that we make all these different things is in part because our forebears have made different kinds of things and have helped us to be in that place and develop within it. So then we can imagine new things too. So what this then enables Ingold tries to do is to dissolve these, what he calls the orthodox dichotomies, or these oppositions between the idea that there's evolution that gives way to history, that there's one thing that is biology and one thing that is culture. And so if that's true, if biology and culture are part of the same process, if evolution and history are part of the same process, then this idea that there has to be some sort of first time or first hut or rupture between what humans were doing before they were cultural and what they do now is an illusion. The search for the first hut, for the beginnings of architecture, history, and true humanity becomes a quest after an illusion. That's if we recognize history as an evolutionary process. So we then turn to a puzzle. What if you see a tree? Oh no, if you see a house and in the yard is a tree, what is the difference? I forgot what the answer is. Willow, what's the difference? Absolutely right. Degree of human involvement. So it's not that there's a house there that's human made and a tree that is natural, which is what a lot of people would want to say. The tree is nature, the house is human, artificial, natural, all those dichotomies. Ingold is here saying the house is as organism. So the house in some ways is growing, it's being lived in with a bunch of non-human animals too, more than we'd even like to have in there a lot of the time. And the tree similarly is being tended by human beings and is also in some ways part of human tending. So again, thus the distinction between the house and the tree is not an absolute, but a relative one. Relative, that is, to the scope of human involvement in the form generating process. Ah, great memory. All right. And so one of the other sort of ending quotes of this is from the philosopher and mathematics guy, Alfred North Whitehead. From the moment of birth, we are immersed in action and can only fitfully guide it by taking thought. This 1938. Good job, Alfred North Whitehead. So immersed in action, and then we try to take thought from time to time. What do you think?